Society generally considers that biological sex is cut and dry. Actually, it's not cut and dry.
Laws targeting gender-affirming care for minors have exploded around the country.
The state's first transgender lawmaker has been officially barred from the House floor.
Intersex people exist, trans people exist. In the governor's letter, he said Montanans who struggle with their gender identity deserve love, compassion, and respect. That's not what trans Montanans need from you. We need access to the medical care that saves our lives.
By trying to fix me, they broke me.
Weigel identifies as intersex, which is the I in LGBTQIA.
Around 2% of the world's population is born with physical traits that land somewhere between those binary boxes of male and female on a birth certificate. You don't hear about us because rather than changing a birth certificate to fit our bodies have traditionally been changed or surgically altered to fit onto a birth certificate.
Good afternoon. I'm Akila Johnson. I'm a health disparities reporter here at the Washington Post. Hello. And, this afternoon, I haven't had enough coffee, clearly. This afternoon, I am very happy to be joined by two wonderful women, Alicia Roth Weigel and Montana State Representative Zooey Zephyr. Welcome to you both.
Thank you so much.
So I'm really excited to have this conversation. And Alicia, I want to start with you. And it's gonna be like let's start with kind of a broad question in terms of gender when we're thinking about gender. And you recently said, you know, you're one of the main subjects of a documentary about the lives and rights of intersex people. And intersex people, as we heard and you say in the introduction, make up about 2% of the population, which you have previously said is about the same amount as redheads.
Yeah.
Did I get that right? Okay. And so, but there's still so little that's known about intersex health. So let's, again, start with this kind of basic question when we think about gender and intersex health and talk a little bit about what exactly that is.
Yeah, so first off, I'd like to pose a question to the audience and ask, quick show of hands, how many of y'all were born with a body? That's all of us, right? And I think it's nice to acknowledge that both because we're living through such divisive times, and that's actually the one thing that all human beings have in common, is that we all have bodies, and it's really nice to be able to latch on to something like that right now. Unfortunately, it's also the one thing that we are most ashamed to talk about. So I'm gonna ask y'all, is it okay if I talk without stigma, without shame, about my body on this stage? Is that cool with y'all? Okay, great, we're cool. So yeah, I was born intersex, which as you heard in the introduction, we're around the 2% of the world's population that is born with physical sex traits. So that can be combinations of hormones and chromosomes, external genitalia, and internal reproductive organs that don't fit neatly into those male-female boxes. What that meant for me is that I actually have XY chromosomes, and despite being born looking entirely female on the outside, instead of being born with a uterus and ovaries, I was born with internal testes. Unfortunately, they were removed from me, forcibly removed from me as an infant. I was sterilized, or given that I was born with balls, let's call a spade, I was castrated. And I think when we hear about forced sterilization, we often think about like other countries, far off places. It happens in board certified hospitals by accredited physicians across the country every single day to intersex people like me. And there are a variety of reasons that are given for that. Overall, it's because there is a huge societal stigma against bodies that don't fit the norm. And what I would like to assert and have y'all walk away understanding is that I think everyone in here probably understands that sexuality is not a binary or not just gay or straight. There's a whole range in between. Gender, people are starting to understand, is also not a cut and dry binary. You're not just a man or a woman. There's this whole non-binary spectrum. But sex is also a spectrum. It affects intersex people like me, who are born with traits that are closer to the center of that spectrum, but it also affects everyone in this room. Some cisgender women have really big boobs and some are flat chested. Some cisgender men can grow a full beard and some can barely grow facial hair. So all of our sex traits exist on a spectrum, right? We as intersex people are just a little bit closer to the center of that spectrum, and society likes things that fit neatly into boxes. So as I mentioned, rather than changing the birth certificate to fit the reality of our bodies, unfortunately, they change our bodies to fit on that piece of paper.
You know, it's really interesting because I'm listening to you talk about bodies, and quite often, and you know, Representative, jump in here, because when I hear conversations about gender, there seems to have been a push to step away from so much focus on bodies and to think more broadly about the spectrum on which gender kind of exists, which you touched on a little bit. And so I guess I'm curious, as we're thinking about gender, what exactly does that mean when we're talking gender? And what does it mean, to you? If that makes any sense.
So just to clarify, what is gender? Like,
yeah,
is that
let's
the
start with,
overarching?
well, right, because I guess we're talking, so often you hear, right, we're talking intersex, but then we're also talking gender. So if we can just have a bit of a primer on like gender.
Yeah, so we're talking about sense of self. We're talking about who do you wake up and feel like in the morning. When we talk about sexuality, you'll say, who do you wake up feeling attracted to? When we talk about gender, I often say, like, imagine a building with a blueprint. One blueprint says male, one blueprint says female. I've got the blueprint that says female, and when I was born, I looked at the construction site and up was the building that said male, and it's like, that's not right, that's wrong. And that creates a sense of incongruence within self. And so many people, they walk through their daily life knowing, well, I was born a woman, I was labeled a woman, I feel like a woman, that's who I am. And that sense of self comes very naturally. For transgender individuals, it's a little bit different. It's often you feel as if, in one of my first ever interviews, I talked about when people talk about gender with a trans person, it's almost like someone is looking directly over your shoulder and talking about a person who they see, who's done the things that you've done, who sounds a whole lot like you, but sure as hell isn't you. And when we talk about gender, that's because they're seeing a gender that is not the sense of self that you have. And when we talk about gender affirming care, that is the care, the broad array of care that allows trans people to come into line with our sense of self.
So given that, what would you like people to reconsider or should people be reconsidering things when they think about gender and how we talk about gender currently?
I think people, starting from the very beginning, people need to trust people when we're talking about ourselves. I often say when I'm talking across the aisle on just politics broadly, you trust that someone came to their beliefs naturally, that they believe their lives are full of nuance, they hold opinions full of nuance. When we're talking about gender, trust people when they tell you who they are. And trust, as Alicia's talking about, that we talk about modes of sex and modes of gender, that we're recognizing more and more that these are bimodal, that there are two large peaks, male and female, and that there's an array in between. And for trans people, sometimes we're in that large peak. I am in the large peak of female. It's just, I was assigned over here. So I think for me, that is the beginning of the conversation around gender. And then when it comes to healthcare, specifically, I would say we talk to our doctors. We trust our doctors. If we're talking about trans healthcare for youth, we're talking about children and teenagers who are having conversations with parents, with therapists, with their doctors, and are following the medical guidelines of every major medical association. And in the same way that if your child had heart disease or Marfan's disease or something, you would trust all of the medical research, all of the medical professionals. When we talk about gender, particularly as it relates to healthcare for trans people, that we lead with that. Trust our doctors and trust the individuals when they tell you who they are.
And when it comes to gender-affirming care for intersex people as well, unfortunately, we are not even given a seat at the table with our parents and doctors to be part of this decision-making. For me, my intersex variation was internal. As I mentioned, I've always looked femme on the outside. Despite having XY chromosomes, I don't respond to androgens or male hormones. And so even in utero, I was like, nah, I don't want that XY blueprint. I'm gonna come out looking the way I want. I've never followed rules. I guess that happened before I was born. But unfortunately, when intersex kids are born, some look less binary on the outside. They might have genitalia that doesn't fit neatly into one of those categories like mine did. And there is an immediate intervention that is done by surgeons to push their genitalia one way or the other. Usually, it is defaulted to make them female because, as one surgeon has been quoted to say, it's easier to dig a hole than it is to build a pole. And so they default to making these children female. Sometimes the children grow up and are like, hey, I don't identify as a woman. No one ever asked me. And then they're trapped in a body that was created for them with them having any say in the matter. And so ironically, when you look at these bans on gender-affirming care for transgender children, these are trans kids who want access to surgery and hormones with their consent. Oftentimes, these are life or death decisions for them. These same surgeries and hormones are forced on intersex kids without our consent. For me, it happened before I could even speak. I was an infant. And so when the justification is used that these trans healthcare bans are to protect children, I politely ask these legislators, okay, if you think gender-affirming care on children is child abuse, or you liken it to Nazi war crimes, so you're okay with abusing some children? You're okay with abusing intersex kids? You're okay with forcing surgeries and hormones onto the bodies of children who have never asked for it and denying the same surgery and hormones to kids who desperately want it? And that just shows that none of this is based in logic, biology, fact, what's healthiest for children. It's based on wanting to normalize children into categories that the rest of the world is more comfortable looking at.
Let's stay with politics for a minute, because you both mentioned politics, and as you're talking policies, ultimately what you're talking about are politics that deal with the politics of gender and the politics of sexuality and the politics of a whole host and spectrum of things, right? And so, you know, Representative Zephyr, you decided to run for office in the Montana State Legislature soon after they passed 3 bills restricting LGBTQ rights in 1 week. And then you became the first openly transgender person to be elected to the state legislature. And then we fast forward to the spring, and you were banned from the House until the end of the legislative session. Talk to us about all of these experiences, and then thinking what Alicia is saying about politics and what that says to you about the politics of gender.
Yeah, so given I'm seeing the clock there, I'll zip up and say this, you know, throughout the legislative session, one of the interesting things is the amount of attacks that we saw and the breadth of them. We saw, I would often say we saw bills targeting trans people's pasts, presents, and futures. When you ban memoirs, you ban an LGBTQ person's past, the story of how they came to understand who they are, which also provides a gap for someone's future to say, oh, I can make it to the other side. Yep. When you ban drag, you're banning an art form that is deeply connected to what it means to be LGBTQIA in this country. And we talk about Stonewall, we talk about the fight there. We forget the fact that this stemmed from 3 articles of clothing laws. We saw bills attempting to define sex as binary, and I stood up in that session and said you could not legislate sex as binary any more than you could legislate that the earth is flat.
Yes.
Trans people exist, intersex people exist. And interestingly, what we saw when we talk about how that impacts policy, we saw, you know, we often, one of the questions that far-right people will often try to bring forward is, what is a woman? What is a woman? And interestingly, 12 states led by Republicans tried to answer that question. Saw 12 bills attempting to define sex. In Montana, they provided 3 different definitions. And every time they brought one up, the medical community came up and said, this excludes a large swath of people. They revised it. This excludes a large swath of people. And eventually they said, well, it's okay that it doesn't account for, you know, a good half of intersex conditions, because really it's about hurting the trans people. Really it is about targeting that community. And when I stood up on the gender-affirming care ban, what we saw is that it wasn't enough to pass the policies. We were seeing a group of people who had a supermajority, full control of the legislature, who said, we actually do not want marginalized communities to stand up and push back against this policy, and we will flex our muscle in order to make sure that they remain silent.
Speaking of politics a little bit, I know that you have done some advocating and advocacy on the Texas floor legislature when it comes to Wendy Davis, right, with the so-called bathroom.
Yeah.
I don't like the term bathroom ban or the bathroom bills.
Well, that's how we colloquially refer to it. And I write about this extensively in my book, Inverse Cowgirl. Not reverse cowgirl, though that's fun too. Inverse cowgirl, because I'm intersex in Texas, get it? But yeah, I came out for the first time as intersex. I was working with a woman named Wendy Davis, who used to be a state senator in the state of Texas, who filibustered for something like 16 hours to kill a bill that would have blocked abortion access in Texas back when we had that, the good old days. Anyway, she was my mentor. I came out to her first, but decided to come out publicly for the first time in front of the Texas Senate before even my own brother knew this about my identity, because only my parents and the doctors ever knew. They tell us to never share our truth because we'll be made fun of or we'll never find a good husband one day. And so I came out for the first time in this Senate hearing because they were trying to pass the bathroom bill, and I kept hearing them use this justification like, biological sex is cut and dry, and once we go back to that, all these trans people will go back where they came from or whatever. And I decided that my story could help shed some light on this for them, because sex is not cut and dry. And basically I wanted to ask them, you know, before you try to pass discriminatory legislation, you should at least open a biology textbook first. And so thank God we killed that bill that day, but we have seen a slew of bills since then, the most in anti-LGBT bills in the history of the United States this past year in Texas. And they're constantly trying to define something that, again, like, the boxes don't exist. We do.
That's an excellent point that I think I just want to have Representative Zephyr have the last word, but it's on this same theme that we're talking about, right? And so as we're thinking about how to conclude this conversation and what you want people to take away from this discussion, where do you really think the narrative is going or should go when it comes to gender as it exists on what is currently a binary scale? Or is that concept being blown up?
So I think it's important to acknowledge that what we're seeing now, so much of the attacks on trans people today, are echoes of attacks on gay people in the 80s and 90s. You know, we have the detransitioners, the same half dozen detransitioners being flown around, much like the same ex-gays were flown around in the 90s and 2000s. Back then it was terms like recruiting, and now we're hearing terms like grooming. So we see the way that these are echoes of one another, and we know the goal is to peel off one group at a time and say, okay, this is the group that we want to target most, and we're going to target trans people because we think we can peel them away. And before we target trans people fully, because we saw what happened with the bathroom ban in North Carolina, we're actually going to just target trans athletes. And we're going to peel that group away, and then the next one and the next one. But we see that when it comes to the anti-trans animus, it is not in part. It is not a single piece of legislation. The attacks are broad. They are targeting every aspect of our life. In Montana, one of those things would, when I die, would mark me as male in my burial certificate. There's no reason for that, but we see those attacks. So if you are looking for how do you respond to that, the first and foremost is going to be to listen to LGBTQ people, listen to trans people when they tell you who they are. Be open to have these conversations, and also understand the way in which this fight is connected to so many of the fights that we're fighting. We talked about the menopause conversation earlier. Trans people are often talking to their doctors and they're saying, hey, the research we have is actually only on cisgender menopausal women. That's what we can talk about with you. If you're a trans person who wants your doctor to believe you, we are in resonance with disability rights activists, with women broadly, with the BIPOC community. We are understanding the fight for access to healthcare is not just a trans issue, but when they come after us in this moment, we are fighting for all of us and our access to the healthcare we deserve.
Absolutely. And the only addition is, when you're having these conversations, don't erase intersex voices. The I in LGBTQI+ stands for intersex, not invisible.
Hell yeah.
That is a great way to end this conversation. I am so grateful for both of you
Thank you.
being here with us. Unfortunately, we're out of time. As you can see, we can continue talking for many, 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 many more minutes and hours about this, but I'm gonna have to leave it there. Alicia Roth Weigel, Representative Zooey Zephyr, again, thank you.
Thank you. Thank y'all so much.
Wait, 2 seconds. I have an announcement, don't run away. I want you all to know we are gonna take a brief break, but feel free, it's where you can feel free to grab some coffee, come right back, but don't go too far. It's about a 5-minute break because SAG-AFTRA President Fran Drescher will be joining us in a few minutes, and that is a conversation you don't wanna miss. Thank you so much. Okay, now we can get up.